To begin. Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Effective Use of NSP2 in Program Income conference call. Today's conference is being recorded. At this time, I would like to turn the conference over to your host, Mr. Les Warner. Please go ahead, sir.
Great, thank you. So welcome, everybody. Today's session, we're going to be talking about program income, the regulations related to it, but also spending some time looking at the issues about planning, projecting the amount of program income, and then making strategic decisions about how to reuse those funds. Today on our speakers list, we have John Laswick and David Noguera from HUD, along with Hunter Kurtz. I'm Les Warner from ICF. And then we have a number of panelists that are going to be assisting in this session. We have Phil Jones from ICF, Jeremy Newberg from Capital Access, Bill Perkins from the Wisconsin Housing Partnerships, and Herman Reyes from Chicanos por la Casa, who are going to participate in this session. So a little bit about the format that we're going to be working with. And since we're in the live meeting session, if you want to ask a question, you can go to the status under feedback and change that square from green to purple to indicate that you want to ask a question. You also can press 1 to ask a question through the conference line, and you'll be asked to provide just your first name. And what we're going to do in trying to make sure that we have adequate time for both the materials, the panelists, and the questions is I believe we're going to hold the questions till the last 30 minutes of this call. We'll go through the slides that we have, spend a little bit of time on a couple of case scenarios, which I hope will be a good illumination for the information that's being presented, and then we will go through and answer questions that have been raised by participants in this session. So the agenda, we're going to be walking through a brief recap of what program income is, the regulations that apply to that, and talk a bit about what's going to happen at the closeout of your NSP grants, and talking a bit about then how you as a recipient of the NSP funds will make decisions both in the short term and the long term on how you're going to strategically keep reusing the revenue that's coming in from program income. As I mentioned, we're going to hold the questions till a little bit later. We will be asking that you hold those based on some comments that we've received from some of our past sessions. And there will be a couple of points where there will be a quiz or a poll that will ask for your participation as part of this process. So we're going to start with the poll, and we want to get a feel for the folks that are on the phone to provide a projection of what you think the amount of program income that your NSP program will earn annually. So folks can go ahead and mark, indicate your projected. And Vinny, are you able to see essentially how many folks at this point or percentage have already voted?
Yes, it should be shown. So 33% have more than $1 million, 15% between $500,000 and $1 million, and 24% between $100,000 and $500,000.
Right. I'm just wondering, should we have enough folks voted, or should we give them a little more time?
I think that's enough time.
Okay. So as you can see, we've got a really wide variety of amounts here, and we've also got some folks that haven't yet made that projection. And of course, some of this issue relates, of course, back to the issue of if our program income is going to be come from sales, we have some unknowns there about how soon those units will sell, and of course, some unknown about the issue of how much revenue will actually be generated on some of those. Okay. So moving into the definitions. So program income is defined by the gross revenue that's going to be received by a grantee or a subrecipient. So you may have a whole number of subrecipients that you may be allowing to retain program income and reuse program income. And we'll talk about some of the requirements from that. So generally, the proceeds are going to be received from things like sale or lease of properties that you acquired, rehabbed, redeveloped. We may have some of our financing, which is going to produce payments over a long period of time of principal and interest. We may have some recapture of home sales where during our affordability period where there's a sale or transfer of that property and some amount of revenue is going to be coming back in. We might have some interest that would be generated from that program income if we have it not immediately going back out. And then things like repayments on liens where we have, a privately owned property, we've placed a lien on that, and at a later point there's a payment on that. And for rental properties that are held by the grantee or the subrecipient, that stream of income that's coming in from the rent on that property, we're able to look at the net operating income. So we're backing out our mortgage and some of our operating costs and looking at a net operating income, and that's also going to be recognized as program income. The things that aren't going to be included in that category, if you have income that comes in within a single year, and that's both for you as the grantee and cumulatively including all your subs, if you were to be under the $25,000 cap, this could be considered essentially found money. Now, that definition includes other federal sources, so you may have NSP, CDBG, home funds, and you may have other income that's coming in within that time period. So generally, folks, as sort of being cautionary on that, simply go ahead, record money as it's coming in as being program income, and take a more conservative approach on that. You also may have interest that would be earned on a revolving loan fund. Of course, we want the funds within a revolving loan fund to go back out quickly, but if you are earning interest on that, that money, the interest has to be returned to HUD to go back into the U.S. Treasury. We also will have instances where a subrecipient disposes of a property 5 years or more after that grant closeout. Those funds are no longer within that category. So you would need to be able to track and show what the actual date was for the closeout for that subrecipient and make sure that those funds actually meet that definition. And then we, of course, have funds that are earned by some of our other entities other than a grantee or a subrecipient. So when we have a developer or an owner of a property, the revenue stream that's coming back in from rent or sales, those are not meeting the criteria to be considered program income. If we also were working with a CBDO, Community-Based Development Organization, those also are exempt from the program income requirements. So what are the strings that are attached with program income after the grant closeout? Well, we still are pending the closeout notice, which is in clearance at this point. There may be some things that will be included in this notice, so you need to make sure that you're paying attention to that and reviewing that. I know, John, do you want to make any comments on this?
I guess the next two bullets are really the comments that we're making these days, which are that even though the closeout notice hasn't been finalized yet, it's looking more and more like it will be NSP program even after closeout. So I think that there's going to be maybe a couple little exceptions to that, but for planning purposes, that's how you should think about it. And the other thing is, once again, to state what we've tried to repeat a lot of times, that there's a big difference between the expenditure deadline next February and March and closeout. The biggest one being that you have to complete all your activities before you can close out. And for those of you who are building new multifamily buildings, for example, it could stretch out quite a ways after closeout, so after expenditure. So again, you don't have to meet all these requirements prior to the expenditure deadline. And after closeout, it's looking like it's going to look, 99% like NSP does prior to closeout.
Great. Okay. So next, what we're going to do, since we've kind of walked through the regulations themselves, is have folks take a quiz. So as you read through these categories, you're to mark which of these is not program income. So go ahead and read through these and make your votes. Okay, so let's take a look at the answers here, and we'll walk through why these other options. So there's only one here, the net rental income that's coming back to an NSP-assisted developer that actually qualifies as not being program income. So let's walk through why these others actually are. So funds that are recaptured by a grantee due to the sale of a home buyer unit. Unlike the home program, where we have a separate category for recaptured funds, under NSP, our recaptured funds are treated as program income and will follow all the rules that apply to our program income. A number of folks thought that this second bullet, the payoff of an NSP loan by a subrecipient to the NSP grantee 11 years after the NSP closeout, would not be considered program income. The issue is that we have a 5-year after the closeout for subrecipients, but we do not have that same rule under CDBG for the grantee themselves. So since this money is coming back to the grantee, it still will hold its identity as program income and still will have to be reused for other eligible NSP activities and tracked, follow the same regulations as the rest of the program income that's coming in.
And the good news on that is that this is, for those of you who are worried about how you're going to continue to pay for your long-term affordability tracking and other kinds of administrative costs out into the future, these kinds of loan repayments or payoffs of recaptured funds from single-family loans will provide some income for that.
Absolutely. So next one here, 50% of the funds coming back to the grantee, and in this case we have a project that had equal investments from both the home and the NSP program on a rental rehab project. So the funds coming back to the grantee are going to be program income, and then we're going to prorate these funds, recognize 50% of them as home program income, and 50% of them would be recognized then as NSP program income. So we're going to end up on the reuse of those funds. Some of that will be following the home eligibility, and some will retain its NSP identity. We've also funds earned or retained by a land bank for NSP-acquired land. This is sold during the 4th year after closeout, and we're presuming here, I believe, that the land bank is probably a subrecipient. It is not after 5 years after the closeout, so we still are within that time period where it's going to be counted. The only time that net rental income is counted as program income is when it's coming back. It's a property that is owned by the grantee or subrecipient, or money that's coming back to the grantee or subrecipient. In this case, we have a developer, and so they are exempt from the program income requirements. And then in the last case, we've got sale proceeds retained by a unit of local government that were funded by the state grantee. They, again, are functioning as a subrecipient. And so once we have funding coming back to the subrecipient or the grantee, it is going to retain its program income identity and need to be reused accordingly.
Just let me throw in here that you can negotiate terms with the developer in which funds would be returned. Technically, that's not program income, but there's nothing to prevent you from doing that or from making a loan to a developer. So just right. I think that was a trick question.
Well, and technically, any money that's coming back to the grantee or the subrecipient is going to be program income. So if you've got, if you've got loans, you've got some other part of your agreement that requires some repayment. If it's coming back to if the repayments are coming back to the grantee or subrecipient, it's going to be program income.
Right. It's just not by default. So.
And that may be part of not wanting to enrich the developer, and also it's a way to have some long-term program funds available to continue to take on needs in your area.
Sure.
So timing on the program income. Well, we know that the program income holds its identity. It's not like money laundering where we can run it through a couple of times and wash away those requirements. So it's each time it comes back to the grantee or subrecipient, it's going to be program income. So you may have funds that will not only be coming back for the first time over quite a number of years, but if the funding is then provided to another eligible activity and it's going to generate program income, we could have, for a long period of time, have NSP money coming back in, being able to be reused to support eligible activities. So while your NSP grant is open, you continue to have the low-income set-aside requirements. So you need to be, until that closeout, projecting what your use will be of not only your original funding, but also program income to make sure that you're going to meet your 25% set-aside. At the point you've actually closed out your NSP grant, it may be that the 25% set-aside requirements may not track with that money, but I suspect that's something that may be addressed in the closeout notice. Has not been finalized at this point. So how are you going to use your NSP money? Well, it's required that it be reused for another NSP-eligible project, and we're going to continue to track the funding in DRGR. So we're going to be receiving the funding in to DRGR. We're going to be setting up the new project and showing how the reuse meets the requirements. So this could be done that all of the money is required to come back to the grantee, or it might be that you're allowing your subrecipients to retain that program income, and that the grantee would be responsible for having a tracking system in place so that they're making sure that program income gets expended prior to drawing other money for that subrecipient. The grantee themselves can be drawing money for other activities, but the subrecipient would need to expend the program income that's held at that local level before coming back to the grantee and asking for additional funds to be drawn. So program income can be used for any of the NSP-eligible activities. We have to meet a national objective as we reuse the funds. So our requirements about abandoned, foreclosed, or vacant properties, the project being located in a target area, and then all of the other federal requirements that go with our use of the NSP dollars, the Environmental Review, Davis-Bacon, all of those standards will also apply, and a grantee will need to have systems in place to make sure as they set up or a subrecipient reuses those funds, that those same sort of processes to track the eligibility, to track compliance for the other federal requirements are also going to be applied to their use of their program income. And again, as John mentioned, for any program income that's receipted into the DRGR system, it then allows you to use 10% of that to cover your admin, some of which is our ongoing compliance for our program. So there's an incentive here to get money coming back in and get it recorded into the system. And that's how we'll be tracking to make sure what your admin cap actually is for each grantee. So the tracking and reporting, as I mentioned, all program income has to be receipted in to DRGR at this point. It also then has to be set up and dispersed, showing in DRGR how those funds are being used on another eligible activity, showing the national objective that will be met as part of this. And you need to be able to track and document the use of those funds for each of your NSP programs. So you may have NSP funding coming in from NSP1, which allowed things like public facilities, where under NSP2 it was not an eligible use for funds. So being able to clearly separate out, is this NSP1, NSP2, or NSP3 funding will also inform you of what your options are on the reuse on this. Once you actually close out your grant, then your program income and how you plan to use that will be included in your consolidated plan, your action plan. And the use of those funds, the money that's being receipted in, will be reported as part of your CAPER or your PER on an annual basis, and we'll be working with IDIS as opposed to DRGR once that transfer happens at closeout. So there's some opportunities related to the program income coming in, but there's also some responsibilities that go along with this. So, your opportunities are, of course, to have some additional money coming in after closeout to be able to continue to take on needed projects in your designated target areas, taking on additional NSP-eligible activities meeting national objectives. And again, those projects will have to be set up within IDIS and being able to track and show how they met the NSP requirements. So part of that is for a grantee or a subrecipient is to have a process in place, is to have systems in place to be able to track as that money is being received, to have systems to make strategic decisions about how we're going to reuse the program income, what's going to be a viable project for us. And then you'll continue to have monitoring requirements during the affordability period, not only of your projects funded with your allocation, but also with program income. So needing to have systems in place to gauge the compliance not only on eligible use, meeting a national objective, but as we have reuse of properties that are held in land banks, needing to show that we met a national objective, needing to make sure that some of our designations on affordability periods and other requirements continue to be met for our reprogramming of funds. So here we want to take a poll and try to get sort of a feel for, as you're looking at going forward with program income, what are the concerns that rise to the most pressing concerns for you? Is it looking at planning, tracking, reporting? Is it using it for other eligible activities? The other federal requirements that go along with this? Not having enough program income to cover your ongoing admin responsibilities? Issues about monitoring that? Or maybe you have no worries at all. if folks can go ahead and make sure everybody votes here. So not surprisingly, it looks like the leading issue as people think about this is, you've got long-term responsibilities potentially for your NSP activities, and you're trying to figure out, do I have enough funding to cover my admin responsibilities? And folks have certainly been talking about that from day one. But I think a lot of us are also looking at this issue and realizing, gee, staffing-wise, system-wise, you need to have a plan in place, be set up to be able to track and staff those responsibilities that will continue to go along with the use of these funds. Not a lot of folks with no worries at this point. Okay. So we want to talk at this point a bit more about, so going forward, as we look at our projection of program income that will be coming in, how do we make decisions about where those future investments should be? What are the current market conditions? And of course, we're talking potentially quite a number of years out in the future. So the market conditions at the point that we're making some of these later investments hopefully we'll see changes and improvements in those markets. So we're going to need to think about what are those market conditions, how do we continue to measure those, what are the types of activities that are going to be appropriate. And then part of this issue that folks had concerns about their being able to cover their admin costs and continuing to run a program is how long are we going to have this program last? Are we trying to make these sources stretch for a longer period of time so we have an ongoing source of funding to be able to take on activities? How are we going to staff that those continued efforts? And then, of course, this issue about how do we track, how are we going to report back on those usage. So as part of this, we generally have all of our activities being eligible under use of our program income. So it will, of course, depend on which NSP funding was the source of the funding. But we can do home buyer rental under NSP 1, 2, and 3. As I mentioned earlier, public facilities was something that was only allowable under NSP 1, and so we'll have a more restricted amount of funding that will be available on that. Demolition is something that we could continue to be able to do. One thing to make sure everybody understands is that new acquisitions for land banks are probably not going to be allowable after closeout, but funding can continue to be used for those land bank portfolios to cover maintenance costs, to dispose of those properties. But to continue to build that land bank portfolio is probably not going to be an eligible activity. So some of the things that need to be a consideration when you're selecting those activity types are, what are the needs for your community? And that now might be in the short term, but we might also be talking sometime in the future. Each community did planning in their initial target areas and their assessments of markets and made decisions about what they believe the right projects were to undertake. And even going through the current implementation period, a number of folks have found that what they thought was going to be a viable type of activity, or what they thought that local market was going to absorb, have changed. So we're going to continue to need to think about and analyze how are we going to target those future investments and make sure that these are still appropriate, still meeting those needs. And of course, we have oftentimes some very strong feelings at the local level about, do we want to promote home ownership? Do we want to promote rentals? And it's not only what does the community want, but what's the reality of that market? If we build a homeownership unit, will we be able to sell it? Will our potential home buyers be able to qualify for financing on these? Is rental maybe what we need to do? So we're going to have this ongoing analysis over time of where are our targets, are these really viable, and do we need to keep going back and rechecking those assumptions as time goes on to make sure that those assumptions are still valid. And then, of course, we have issues about the beneficiaries, the community that we're trying to serve, and thinking about what are the income levels, factors such as, private lending criteria have an impact on this, but also things like special needs populations. And we typically have some harder to serve populations or underserved populations that we may, as part of our priorities, try to figure out how can we harness the program income that's coming in over the future to continue to try to make investments in these particular areas. So as part of this, we're trying to not only look at what program income will we have from NSP, but also looking at that mix of other funding and try to figure out what resources will we have available. Our NSP incomes are, of course, targeted up to 120%, but we have a restriction of foreclosed, abandoned, and vacant properties. So when we get into the case scenarios in a minute, we're going to be looking at, okay, are some of the needs that are identified by a community, are they something that we actually can meet an NSP criteria on, or may we have to use some other sources of funds? And then how do we choose when we're going to combine our funds with other funds, and what's the impact of that? If we add in another funding source that has more restrictive requirements on income, longer-term affordability, those sorts of things, in trying to figure out how do we manage these projects and how do we best combine to have the most comprehensive approach on trying to meet some of those needs.
Les, I just want to throw in just, an observation that a lot of people have made, which is that NSP is also useful in that it does not have per unit cost limitations and some other things. And so I've heard any number of folks say, well, we've got these really expensive projects. Maybe they're historic. Maybe they're just a lot of code violations and things that you can't realistically reach with your CDBG program or your home program. And so NSP, just as another advantage, I think has the ability to go into those sort of harder cases or more expensive cases where others may not be able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. You almost need to have a side-by-side in looking at each of the available types of funding and recognize what the flexibilities are with those funds and the limitations, and then try to best match the needed project to how you get the most use of the flexibility without pulling in unintended restrictions that are going to make things a little difficult for you. So I wanted to add in, we don't specifically have a slide talking about this projection, but one of the issues for, I think, each grantee is going to be trying to figure out how much program income am I likely to receive, and when might those funds actually be generated. So, if you have a portfolio where you have loans, it may be very easy to be able to project over, 20, 30 years that you have loan payments that are going to be coming in, and so you have a very predictable stream. For other projects, particularly where you're doing home buyer projects, you need to essentially be able to look address by address, make projections about not only when those units will be completed, but projections on the sales, what you believe the proceeds that will be coming back from the sale of those units, so that you can begin to put together pretty good projections of how much program income, when it will be received. Some of this also may inform your projections on how much funding will you have available for admin to be able to continue to staff your programs to deal with the compliance issues. So keep some of that in mind as we move forward into a couple of case examples. So what we're going to do at this point, we have our panel of experts, and we've asked them to look at these case scenarios and kind of respond. So our first scenario that we're looking at is a rental housing project. We've got an NSP2 grantee that has a long waiting list, well-documented need, unmet need for affordable rental housing, and they've recognized that in particular there's a need for service-enriched housing for homeless, disabled, and elderly persons. And this grantee has established the West Side as a target neighborhood, and they've got 3 available types of properties. They've got numerous large foreclosed single-family houses. They know that they have dilapidated but occupied multifamily rental properties. And there's also a home tax credit project that's owned by a CHOTA that's in default. So this grantee, in looking at this, they get NSP2 program income. They also have an annual allocation of home funds and CDBG funds. But, of course, all these resources are relatively tight and, of course, have other demands for those. So in looking at this scenario, we've asked our experts to kind of think about what are some of the options on the use of the program income and how might they leverage these available program income dollars with some of the other resources available. I think, Jeremy, I'll ask you to kind of lead off on this, if you would.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. You know, as I was looking at this, the first question that comes to mind is, what do you do well already? What have you had success with currently? I know that these are 3 distinct investment opportunities, but one of the things that we observed with the NSP is that there was a certain amount of mobilization time to get things going, and I would look at that very, very carefully. When you see numerous large foreclosed single-family homes, well, of course, that's a function of where they're located, what is the market, and the demand. If it is large, how large, and for which buyer and market that you're looking for. The dilapidated but occupied multifamily rentals is, of course, triggering a relocation component if all the units have to be fixed up. So there becomes a cost and time component. And then a home low-income housing tax credit project by a CHOTA that's in default might be something where you could plug in NSP funds. The question is, what are you going to do differently in terms of the operation of the project so that it succeeds? So in looking at all these different options, the key question is, what does your grantee do well? What do you have a track record of doing well? And or what do the partners that you have existing relationships with or partners that have a track record do well, just so that you can do a project that's positioned for success? How's that first start?
Bill, do you want to maybe comment on the NSP implications, the requirements, and how that might fit with some of these prospects?
Well, I think that's a good question, Les, and I think that Jeremy's correct that we want to look at capacity. I think if we think about this in terms of the what we can use money for and what's immediately available to us, we might come at this from a different perspective. You know, the occupied multifamily rental properties, just because they're there and dilapidated, may not be available to us. We may not be able to acquire them with NSP, and we might not, you know, they wouldn't qualify in most scenarios. We don't know whether the CHOTA that's in default would would qualify or not, this project. It might qualify under the foreclosed definition, but could we acquire it and work on it? Who knows? I think that if I was looking at it from the rules of the funding sources, I'd say, well, the foreclosed single-family homes are the place that jumps out at me as being eligible for NSP, and I might carry out some kind of triage there where I do some demo, I do some land banking, maybe I do some home buyer assistance, and maybe I go out to my service providers because I need service-enriched housing and see if some of these houses are large enough that one of my service providers wants to do some group homes. In looking at the needs, I'd like to try and address this need somehow, and quite honestly, looking at this list, in order to address my need for service-enriched housing, some of those large single-family homes might be my best option. I don't know without talking to the service providers and looking at the properties, but that would be an investigation I would carry out. I think for the occupied multifamily rental properties, that probably CDBG or home is a better way to offer assistance to those properties than trying to figure out how to acquire them and do them with them. The home project, I would probably try to get troubled project assistance through HUD before I tried to acquire the property and take it over with some other source. So those are some thoughts from the perspective of where the easiest way to use NSP money is, and according to the rules.
Bill or Herman, I wonder if you had thoughts about just sort of either the timing or the logistics on being able to take these sorts of projects on, or other concerns?
I'll chime in. This is Herman. I'll piggyback on the previous comments. When I saw the numerous large foreclosed single-family homes, I immediately thought of maybe grouping, having some kind of group strategy, given that there's a demand and a waiting list for, some of those special needs populations. I definitely would immediately go look at that and see if there's a viable place in some of these properties to do a group home type of strategy. I think that makes a lot of sense. In terms of the multifamily, the one thing that I would go in and look at is if it's dilapidated enough, I think that it may be useful to pursue a blighted strategy potentially in order to try and land bank that as a multifamily rental. But not knowing that, then I would also maybe earmark that more for home or CDBG. But again, the dilapidated piece, I guess, to the extent that it's very dilapidated, I might pursue see if I can pursue some kind of a blighted designation if I had NSP funds that I could insert there. On the CHODO, I think that I'd be very interested in looking at something like that from a partnership standpoint with the CHODO to see if you can cure that default using NSP. So, and I think that that's going to be something that might, present an opportunity to grantees across the country as we move forward, because I do believe there's going to be, and there are now existing low-income housing tax credits and other tax credit properties that I think are very viable for NSP2 type of investments. But, that's my input.
Bill, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, Bill Perkins. I focused a lot in looking at this on the CHODO project because my organization has done an awful lot of work with CHODOs, and so much of whether this is an opportunity or not depends on the specific circumstances. There are situations where one thing I want to know, for example, is whether the default is caused by sort of financial problems or problems perhaps in the condition of the project that make it more difficult to rent. It might be able to be cured by infusing some more money. There are also situations where that's not the reason for the default. The default may be poor management or inadequate management, and we just don't know whether the project is some fundamental underlying problems or if it's problems in the channel. The same is true with sort of what the status of the CHODO itself is. Is it a CHODO that and again, we worked with chodos that got themselves into situations that after the fact they wish they hadn't, and would be happy to be relieved of it. And we've also worked in situations where the opposite is the case, where the chodo is very interested in staying involved and being part of the solution to the problem. From the grantee's point of view, which we're not, a lot of what you decide to do would depend on how critical this chodo is to you. We have worked as consultants to grantees that only have one chodo. And in that case, you don't want to do anything that would jeopardize the sort of viability of this chodo as the wrong kind of intervention could do. In other cases, you have multiple chodos, and it might not be such a huge issue if the solution to the project problem ended up sort of damaging the long-term viability of the chodo. Maybe a chodo that's run its course in terms of viability. So there's a lot of specific factors that relate to that. Looking at the other two, I was sort of attracted. I combined the needs in the community with the opportunities, if you want to call them that. I was more attracted by the dilapidated occupied multifamily rental properties because converting large foreclosed single-family homes to rental housing is not always that simple. You got a different kind of problem with the dilapidated occupied multifamily rental properties because if they are fully occupied, there isn't that much of an opportunity to use the housing they provide for the people who are in need because they're full.
Right.
So it's a series of very complicated possible choices that you got to look at very carefully.
So I kind of hear the whole group talking about things like capacity, not only internally, but, a potential partner. If we were talking about managing group homes, clearly having a partner who understood and had brought the capacity, some issues about, how far scattered are these sites. But then a whole overlay of, how do we make this eligible for use for NSP funds? When we look at the chodo project, which has home and tax credit in that, we also have this overlay of those requirements. The home project may still be within an affordability period, tax credit restrictions. So a lot of analysis on the front end to try to figure out what are the best ways to try to fulfill and meet those targeted needs. And, of course, part of this also is this issue of not only what are the other resources available, but being able to accurately project what NSP program income do you have or will you have in the short term to be able to apply to taking this on. Great. Thank you very much for the panel. So moving on to look at a couple of the issues about this. So you will continue to have to work for NSP1 in your projects of various greatest needs. So you might, over time, be needing to go back and change, or you might need to expand to those target areas. We've talked again about continuing to monitor the marketing factors and making sure that the unit type that you're talking about or where you're going to place projects continue to be the right decisions to make. And again, anything that you are doing needs to follow what was in your con plan and continue to use the available data that would be as part of that. For NSP2 and NSP3, the guidelines require a 20% impact in the target areas. That ends after closeout, but grantees should still consider those outcomes and those targets. And again, we're looking at neighborhoods that continue to have high levels of foreclosure, abandonment, and vacant units. So as part of this, each opportunity, as we have a flow of program income, we continue to have to make those strategic decisions, analyzing what we have the capacity to take on ourselves and with our partners, and then also what's going to work within the program requirements, within those market requirements. So our second case example here is for home buyer housing. And in this case, we're looking at a local market that's begun to recover in many or most of their neighborhoods, except in their lowest income areas. They continue to have foreclosed units, but they are being purchased by, in the moderate income areas, they're being purchased by investors. The foreclosure and abandoned houses are available in very low income neighborhoods, but we have construction costs that are going to far exceed what the after either construction or rehab values are going to support. And we've got home buyers in those areas expressing concerns about buying in these very low income areas. At the same time, we have local leaders that are still have a very strong preference for home ownership versus rental projects. So having something be politically feasible for something other than home ownership may be a little difficult. We're finding that low-income households are not able to get financing. They can't afford to buy houses that are in standard condition. In this case, the grantee is predicting to earn $2 million in program income over the next 5 years, and they want to foster home ownership in the very low-income neighborhood. And so we're going to look to our panel, again, to make some suggestions of how they might target their program income. So I think, Herman, I'm going to go to you first and get your kind of insight on this.
Sure. Yeah, this one is a little bit of a little tricky, I suppose, because when you look at it, there's almost some conflicting data here, right? And so what I would say is you really need to take a look at your strategy and figure out what is it that you are tasked your folks to do. So, for example, we have a specific strategy to target low-income and very low-income individuals. So I would say, to answer your question about would you foster home ownership in very low income, I would say absolutely. Now, we understand that by doing so, we likely will eat through our program income, if you will, much faster because of the development subsidy and direct subsidy that will have to go into those deals. However, assisting very low-income buyers is something that we pride ourselves in. So what we try and do to not have, and moving forward, of course, if this is your strategy, to not have so much subsidy, be taken on each deal is, we look to aggressively layer our funding. So, in some areas, in some markets, there is existing funds to go after. Here in Phoenix, for example, Wells Fargo has a great program, Neighborhood Lift program. We're looking to try and layer some of those lift funds, to allow us to not lead so much direct subsidy. But again, we are specifically targeting in certain areas that low-income market. So, assuming the demand is there, and per the data on this slide, the demand is there on the very low-income side, so we would do that. However, we wouldn't, we would still continue to look at the moderate, all the other areas, given that there's demand there. But it's tricky. So we definitely believe in home ownership. In many cases, we understand that, rental or for us, a lease option might be a better approach for those individuals that perhaps will be in a better situation 3 years down the road in terms of income. So you have to, in a way, look at your entire strategy, see how you can affect, all these home buyers, right? But if your strategy is very low income, we'll focus there, but we'll always continue to focus on the up to the 120% AMI buyer, if you will. So lots of good stuff here. The other thing that I would say is, for some of the very low income neighborhoods that we see, we are trying in some cases to see if we can't pool our assets. So when we go out in a way to leverage our program income, you can look at purchasing assets across all of these neighborhoods, right? So by doing so, if you can leverage a pool sale, for example, that's something that we're aggressively going after. So we are able to take our our program income dollar and spread it across some of these neighborhoods and ensure that we have housing stock in the very low income up through the moderate neighborhoods. So anyhow, so I think this is a good slide, but it's very dependent on what your strategy is, and so thank you.
Great. Phil, I wondered, since it seems like this is a case where being able to project availability on funds might be critical, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how one might make those projections?
Well, yeah, I think that where we've seen this work, we've asked the developers involved in the work to actively, they're required to report a projected sales price even when they're doing the specs on the houses, and projected completion date of construction, marketing period, and so on, and then the net revenue. And just a comment on the tracking device that we've used is that we build the program income into a running budget total, both in the finance department and the production department, so that you can see your projected budget as well as your actual budget as program income is achieved. And you're able to carry your planning out a little farther when you're in that situation. I did want to make a couple comments on this situation.
Great.
Because what I see is some conflict between what the market is saying and what the local leaders are saying. And if I was walking into this place if I was the CD director, I'd say, hey, let's do some careful market analysis that's really place-based. In other words, we're going to look at these specific neighborhoods and figure out whether anybody will buy a house in these neighborhoods, number one. So we get an objective viewpoint here because it looks like there's some contradiction. I think, too, that I like the idea of the lease-to-purchase option idea. I think that if I was going to pursue this, I would make it clear with my developer that we're going to develop with home ownership in mind, but we may need to go to rental if we can't sell the houses. Because what the worst thing that's happening across communities when they've gotten too aggressive with home ownership is end up stuck with inventory they can't sell. And then if you have not planned for that, you're in a real twist about do we need to give more subsidy? Can we find somebody that will manage these as rentals and so on? So I would really encourage people who are entering into risky neighborhoods to be prepared for the possibility that houses might not sell and have a contingency plan.
Great.
And I'll leave my comments on this slide at that.
And it might be that in looking at that absorption rate of the market and looking at your funding coming in, you might make some sort of sizing of a home ownership activity if you could solve the other issues based on not only the availability money, but sort of what's going to work for you. Jeremy or Bill, want to join in with some other comments?
Can I get in on this?
Absolutely.
Jeremy? Okay, so in Michigan, with the Michigan NSP2 program, every single city, including Detroit, Pontiac, Flint, Benton Harbor, houses are selling in every single city. And we didn't have to switch gears to a lease-to-purchase or scattered site rental program. So here are some of the lessons in thinking through the strategy and the program design. It starts with the house in terms of build a move-up home at a starter home price. If you're going into an area where there's a perception of low value, low quality of life, poor services, perhaps poor performing schools, perception of crime, then make sure with whatever funds you have available that when you choose to acquire a house, you can look out the window of that house and see reasonably well-maintained properties. If there's a vacant and blighted structure within eyesight of the house you're trying to sell in a perceived low-income neighborhood or verified low-income neighborhood, it's real hard to sell that house. So if you're going to buy that house, make sure that you can look out of any window and see reasonably well-maintained. And so the move-up home to a starter home price concept is build gorgeous. That's part of NSP, is infusing value into neighborhoods as part of the stabilization strategy. It does cost money. That's part of your budget. The second is try to do some clustering in terms of scattered site concentrated so that the houses that you're either rehabbing or building new, some sense of within eyesight of each other so that you see the benefit of, hey, there's investment going on here. 3, wherever possible with your home or CDBG, bring in some homeowner rehab money to support the blocks where you're improving a house with NSP. 4, homebuyer cultivation and financial counseling is a profession unto itself. And one of the things we learned from doing the NSP clinics this year was that a number of grantees would come and say, the lenders aren't cooperating, the lenders are terrible, boo to the lenders. But we had to ask a question. How much work are you doing to prepare your buyers for the mortgage application? Have you done the credit report? Have you done the affordability analysis? Have you looked at a front-end and back-end ratio? Have you addressed the credit issues and the mitigating factors for a strategy to help get that buyer ready for the mortgage application? And then the 5th piece is, with $2 million, you can do something, but it's $2 million over 5 years. So maybe your first year you only get $400,000. Well, you might only be doing 2 to 4 houses in that first year. But if you're getting program income from the sales and then another $400,000 from another source, well, now you're getting 48, and then you get 6 to 10 units. So there is a potential, but as Phil said, you've got to really project how your revenue is coming in and be relatively conservative with the money, because things do take time. And I just want to close where it said, local leaders have expressed a strong preference for home ownership versus rental. Okay, wonderful. The key thing is that if you're working with an elected official and they want you to go into a lower income neighborhood where there is blight, and you want to sell them on a beautiful house because you want that house sold, chances are the subsidy may be much deeper than people are comfortable with. And so the principle here is you might be looking at a house that costs $200,000 to rehab, and it only appraises for $80,000, and you've got a $120,000 subsidy, and people may be offended by that. Well, the response is you're not just subsidizing that house, you're subsidizing all the other houses on that block to begin to position that particular block to incrementally improve in value. That's what I got.
Great. And Bill, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I would just want to absolutely reinforce and underscore what Jeremy just said. When we go into situations where a community says they want to change market dynamics, which is what this is really about, it's not a house issue, it's a neighborhood issue, a neighborhood housing market issue. If they say they want to change the neighborhood dynamics, we say, okay, that's wonderful, but you have to think very, very hard about what is it going to take to do that in very specific terms, what is it going to cost to do that, and do you have the money? Because if you don't, the worst thing you can do is do a bad job at what may be a very noble objective, but you're going to be discredited yourself if it doesn't work. You know, doing making a good try and doing something that you know you can't do going in is just foolhardy. It doesn't help you. It doesn't help the cause, if you want to think of it that way, of revitalizing neighborhoods or offering homeowner shelters to lower-income families. So be very, very serious about and very hard-nosed about analyzing what the costs are going to be and what the source of money are, size the neighborhood or the target area to the resources you have. You just cannot take on too big an area compared to the amount of resources you've got. And in this case, you know, one of the issues that's going to, somebody would have to think about really seriously is the fact that it says most available foreclosed units are purchased by investors. well, if that continues, that's going to undermine what you're trying to do in the progress that you're trying to make. So you've got to figure out some way to either prevent that from happening or, if it's possible, co-opt those investors so that you make them your partners. That depends on who they are and what their motivations are, and I don't want to be Pollyannish about it. But if you don't have the resources to compete with them, to buy properties instead of them, you better figure out some way to turn what they're now doing, which you see as destructive, into something as constructive as possible.
Great. That may sound counterintuitive, what Phil just put forth. It's actually brilliant. But it means engaging in a conversation with a class of real estate investor, developer, and manager that the grantee may not have done before. And there could be a lot of trust issues. There could be a lot of, on both sides, can this local government get me the money when I need it? Are they going to keep their promise? And so there's a fair amount of relationship building that has to happen. But if a private investor wants to put money in a moderate income neighborhood, and you can strategically deploy your NSP funds to, for an example, you can use your NSP funds as the construction funding, as the development appraisal gap, and as a homebuyer affordability gap to offset for down payment and closing cost assistance, so long as we're serving low, moderate, and middle income buyers. But as the investor sees reliable capital to work with, and then you impose the energy efficiency standards, the lead-based paint removal and removal of hazardous materials standards, and then some marketability standards, as soon as they see reliability of funding and they clearly understand the rules, you can go somewhere with that. And it really might be something worth exploring.
Great, thank you. So I would just also throw in here, I think, if this locality also receives CDBG and home, this might be an opportunity where you try to think about, might you want to align part of your targeting of those funds to these same areas? So if you have issues that buyers are expressing about some of these neighborhoods, can you overlay some rehab of the other existing owner-occupied units to help stabilize that neighborhood? Might you use CDBG funds for public service activity to do, home buyer education and work with households that have credit issues? So looking at what those opportunities are, not just with NSP, but also with your other sources of funds that you may have available. Okay, so moving on. So how long is your program going to last? Well, clearly, depending on how you're able to project when program income is going to be coming in, how you're going to reuse that program income, and whether that may continue to have money coming back for the long term, you're then having to think about how am I going to gear up, how am I going to have systems in place. Some folks are trying to have the money as early as possible, go as heavy with subsidies, and try to essentially get the money back out and expended and done with. Other folks may be looking at this as if they can create maybe a more modest stream of income, but have it for the long term, and then build systems around that. It will add yet another source of funding alongside the restricted, sometimes limited funding that's available, to be able to try to take a sort of longer term approach as part of this. So either way that we are addressing this, we have to think about what are the implications of how our program operates, the staffing, the tracking, those sorts of requirements. We'll mention here there's a policy alert that was put out on August 20th of this year that relates to revolving loan funds, which we're going to talk about in a moment, and that can be found on the NSP Help website, along with not only the transcripts but also the recording of the revolving loan fund webinar, which might be something, if you missed, to go back and spend a little time with.
Les, this is John. I just wanted to throw in a couple of numbers here that might have give us a little sense of scale, but just last week we went over $700 million cumulatively in program income to date in all three NSP programs. In the NSP1 program, 45% of the grantees, or 138 grantees, have over $1 million already in program income, and 35 of them have more than $5 million in program income. And in NSP2, 38% have over $1 million already. So, and honestly, I think we're really just about maybe a third of the way into this flow of funds here. So, to me, it sounds a lot more significant, and it's something that it would be difficult. I mean, I think there's arguments you can make for spending it as fast as you can and getting out, but it seems to me that a lot of these places are going to have quite a stream for quite a long period of time.
Absolutely. So we're going to talk a little bit about revolving loan funds, which essentially are a subset of program income and give a little bit of flexibility within the program income rules. So the CDBG program has always had revolving loan funds, not something that the home program has provided. And it essentially allows you to take a subset of your program income and set it aside for a particular type of activity. This would be something that you would have to lay out in advance. It would be part of your action plan. And based on the name revolving funds, these funds are to be going out for more activities and hopefully generating more revenue coming back in and continuing to feed this fund. But it's not a way to essentially set funds aside and kind of park them out of the way. So when you're undertaking activities funded by with a revolving loan fund for an NSP eligible activity, you of course have to meet all of the eligibility, national objective, all the other federal requirements, but it allows you to have that money setting for a specific type of activity, as opposed to with program income, you are going to expend it immediately for the next eligible activity of any kind. So you could combine in a revolving loan fund funds from both NSP1, NSP2, and NSP3, but because you have different requirements that follow with the different fundings, you're going to have to be able to track what the source was of those funds so you continue to meet those requirements, which could clearly become a little more complicated over time as those funds continue to revolve. So as part of this, the thing to remember is that revolving loan funds are something that are established with program income. This is not something that you can capitalize that account by simply drawing funds out of DRGR and setting up a revolving loan. It's a fund that you are designating as where program income that's generated from an NSP eligible activity will go to. And of course, the reason that you would consider developing a revolving loan fund is that instead of following this first in, first out rule with program income, you're able to set aside and essentially build a fund to be able to take on specific activities that might be the priorities that you've set. So as part of this, the funds have to be in an interest-bearing account. The funds that are going to be earned on that have to be remitted back to HUD. And this is to not have you have an incentive to have the funds just sitting in an account as a way to build up more interest. Now, interest that's paid from the borrowers who are making loan payments back to you, that will be program income. It will be in your revolving loan fund. That builds your revolving loan fund. But that interest that you are earning yourself by having it sit in your interest-bearing account will have to be remitted back to HUD. And these could be held both at the grantee level or the subrecipient level, depending on which way you have set those up. So we want to take a poll here. Does your grantee have an existing revolving loan fund, either NSP or CDBG? So it looks like, at least initially on the numbers, that we've got a lot of folks that do not have revolving loan funds, either with NSP or CDBG. Certainly we've got some folks here, 21% and rising, it looks like, who are thinking about maybe doing that. A group that already has CDBG revolving loan funds but may not have chosen to adopt that as part of their use of program income for NSP. And then we can see a relatively small number of folks who have designated either for homeownership assistance or rehab and construction already have those existing accounts. And I think that's something that a number of our NSP grantees may be spending some time looking at to think about this. Okay. So who will administer? Well, we've got a number of options. Obviously, you as the grantee or your subrecipients, but you might also have, a housing authority, a contractor that's going to be working on your behalf. No matter who is going to be administering the program income, the requirements about first in, first out, the tracking, the reporting will have to be handled. We need to make sure that we have set this process up in our action plan, in our consolidated plan. We're tracking the income that's being earned. We're making sure that we're expending the program income first before we draw down other funds. For revolving loan funds, if we have a similar type of activity, we would be drawing those funds before we would be drawing new funds. And then making sure for those reuses of the funds that we're reporting how we're using those, that we're reporting how those reuses met the NSP requirements, and you'll have a responsibility on tracking and reporting on that. So as part of this, grantees have to have a system in place to figure out how am I going to collect this information, how am I going to make sure that I have the data in place, that I'm making that reporting. And this becomes of particular interest when you are not directly holding that program income, but you are having a subrecipient hold it. So if a subrecipient is going to be earning program income and you are making sure that that program income is expended before you process a draw for them, as part of each draw request, you're going to have the subrecipient provide you with a reporting of any program income that has been received since their last draw request, so that you can make sure that that program income is receipted and then reused before drawing additional funding. So as part of this, most folks will have systems on what is included in their draw request. They're going to have spreadsheets, approval forms. They're going to be making sure that their processes that track things like environmental review, labor standards, all have a way of identifying and making sure that those same levels of oversight are also being applied to the use of program income. This will have to go forward not only until we have closeout, but after closeout we'll still be dealing, instead of in DRGR, we'll still be dealing within IDIS and making sure that we have appropriate reporting that's happening and eligible reuse on our funding. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Herman and ask you to talk a little bit about some of the projects that your organization is undertaking.
Okay, thank you. And you'll move the slides forward as we...
Yes, just let me know when you want it moved and I'll move it.
Okay, great. So I was asked to talk a little bit about Chicanos por la Causa's program, and specifically, how we're doing around program income and our strategy. So to kind of lay the groundwork, we did receive $137 million in NSP2, and we are part of a consortium comprised of 13 nonprofit members across the country. We are working in 15 distinct markets, and I highlight the fact that they're distinct because, as was highlighted earlier, in some markets we're seeing some very aggressive appreciation of value, if you will, and aggressive buying. So it lends itself nicely to a certain strategy as it relates to sales and then generation of program income. In other markets, it isn't quite as aggressive, so very unique. So I'll get a little bit more into that. As of I guess last Friday, I think that's the last data point I had. We were approximately $40 million of program income generated and expended, and so I'm happy to say that's obviously very aggressive on our end. Most of the program income is as a result of single-family sales. So even though we were approved for all 5 eligible activities across the 13 nonprofit grantees, the majority is under Activity B, and the majority within Activity B is single-family, and then some multifamily, but primarily single-family. So what I will say is the last data point we have, I think, is roughly 80 to 83% of the program income is in single-family resales. So I think that tells a tale of our grantees, mainly that we are all nonprofit developers, and also, for the most part, we're also great housing counseling, certified housing counseling agencies. We certify buyers, of course. We have a strong pool of buyers across the country and are able to, I like to say, streamline that process, get buyers into homes, and I think that's one factor anyhow in how quickly we've been able to turn some of this income. Most of this $40 million, as you all know, happened over the last year, maybe 14 months, given the ramp up of NSP2. So what I will also say is that as we crafted our programs early on, we signed up, obviously, as part of our plan to some very aggressive numbers, which we all call national objectives now, of course. We have signed up for approximately 1,000 single-family units, and then approximately another 1,000 or so, it's actually a little bit more, of multifamily land bank demolition. So in order to get those kinds of numbers of objectives met, it obviously implied that we would recycle some of the 137. So we have built in, not to every member, again, there's 13 members, but certainly the ones that had greater single-family impact, we have created within those plans the notion that we would resell and then take income to continue to buy. So that's how we initially had planned. So it was built into our plan, for the most part, to recycle and generate that program income. So we can move forward. So, maximizing program income, at least for me, I along with several others here at CPLC, run the national program, and part of what we did early on was we made it a priority again to try and maximize that program income, again, because we understood that in order to achieve ultimately our national objectives, we would have to recycle through that. So, for me, that is what I called, leverage. For me, leveraging the program wasn't necessarily going out and finding, other sources of funds to leverage against the grant, but the grant itself, through the recycling of the monies, right, selling the property and recycling what we now know to be program income, is in a way the leverage that I was seeking, right? That's leveraging. So, for example, right now we have a $137 million grant. We feel strongly, and we have a goal of generating as much as $65 million of program income. So again, that comes from the grant. In a way, we've leveraged that $137 million grant to what we hope, ultimately, is a goal of ours, and that is to say that we've, invested $200 million into the community, all of the recycled, the recycled $63 million of program income. So again, that leverage is something that we focused on early on and continue to focus on. There's a lot of benefit, of course, with creating this additional value, right, in terms of recycling the funds. And for us, again, as nonprofit organizations, those extra dollars mean literally the ability for us to create capacity. amongst our nonprofit organizations. And that capacity building is something that we are taking to heart. We're taking that very seriously. We understand that this grant, obviously expires here in the next 4 or 5 months, of course, and then there's a closeout period, of course. But we want to be in a position to, take on other projects, of course. The learning and the capacity that we've undergone and experienced over the last 3 years, I think, is going to be, something that is a legacy that we know, we're creating as a result of NSP2. So that, again, obviously, as a result of generating more funds, we continue to create benefit to the community. One of the things that we are extremely excited about is the jobs numbers, if you will, that we can report. Of course, we have the Section 3 and whatnot, the other things that come in, that come with the NSP2 grant. But one of the things that we definitely are very keen about, and given the jobs, outlook out there in the country, of course, is the idea that creating additional value through these dollars a la program income allows us to create additional jobs. And one of the things that we do is we revert back to several numbers out there, but there is something that was put out by the President's Council of Economic Advisors that for every $90,000 in expended funds, you create approximately one job or you retain one job. And again, lots of us have probably seen some of these numbers, and they may vary, from that. But if we take that as a baseline, obviously 63 million or what have you, whatever it is that we'll ultimately do, for me anyhow, it's telling the story of creating additional value through jobs, and for us, jobs is what continues to help stabilize communities out there. So for us, it's something that we'll continue to really push forward. I think this was mentioned, but obviously for us also, we also understand that the additional dollars permit you to take additional admin, which is how we, expect to continue to run the program forward. So that is something that obviously was very important that HUD built into the, that program, which obviously makes this possible for us. So, okay, you could move forward. So for us, from a strategy, I'll be a little repetitive here, but early on, I think that what was very important was, for us to essentially get our mind in check about the ability for us to develop projects and to provide development subsidies and direct subsidies to home buyers. And what I mean by that is, this whole idea of acquiring a property and then rehabbing the property, of course, and then having a total development cost that exceeded the current appraised value of the home was okay. We did not have to go out and recapture that total development cost. So and not only that, you're able to provide additional direct subsidy to a home buyer to make the home affordable. So once we got a grasp of that, because it isn't something that early on, of course, you kind of battled with this whole idea that no, I really need to capture more of my TDC before I sell this house. It was something to overcome and to say it's okay to leave some of the subsidy, not irresponsibly, of course. You have a home buyer that qualifies. It's just that they need additional subsidy through direct. You're already leaving some in the development subsidy. But again, the idea that it's okay to sell is really, I think, the first hurdle, the real big hurdle that we overcame. And then after that, it was easier to really move forward with our program at a large scale. Also, I think early on, when HUD came back and basically told us that the program income generated wouldn't count against you in terms of acquiring or attaining your 100% expenditure, that obviously was a huge factor for us because, again, based on the numbers that we're showing now, right, we had anticipated generating a lot of program income, so we didn't want that to be, we didn't want those that were generating a lot of program income, we didn't want that to be a disadvantage to us because then we had to spend that first before we could attain our 100% expenditure. So the way HUD came back and allowed for program income to be a part of the 100% expenditure was very critical to us early on as well. And then going back to this whole idea of selling, what we really impressed on our members was, and I used the idea of 80 cents versus $1 just as a kind of a placement there. There's nothing unique about 80 cents or a dollar, but basically what I wanted to really convey to our groups is that if you have a home buyer that's willing to purchase and is qualified to purchase a house, but you have to sell it at a point where maybe you're getting 80 cents now versus maybe, let's say you have an opportunity and you could have sold it for $1 a year from now, we are probably more inclined to try and sell it and get that program income back because you have to consider things like holding costs if you aren't able to sell or what have you. Early on, we saw the effects of holding costs, and those ate through potential program income very quickly, not to mention the whole idea of the lost opportunity to take that money, those 80 cents back in, and redeploy it through, further acquisitions. So for us, that was something that was a key role, right? The idea that it was okay, again, to leave that subsidy and get that money turned. And so, and frankly, the market has shifted and turned, as many of all know, from the first, the first time we looked at these scenarios a couple of years ago, where the market wasn't as strong. It really was difficult to do this. Now, knowing that the market's going up, it's obviously there's demand, and it's these decisions aren't as difficult to make anymore. Okay, move forward. So, also wanted to highlight that we do have something we call an NSP2 portal. That's a technology. It's a system that we have in place to tie in all our nonprofit organizations with us here at the national level, and that is a tool that we use to run all of our transactions. It definitely is one that we use to reconcile sales so that we're able to take in the program income, account for it. We then have a system in place so that we know exactly what our program income revenue is and our ledger is. And of course, we then have to get that dispersed out as members ask us for additional transactions. So the NSP2 portal for us has been instrumental in allowing us to run the number of transactions that we do. So we have many, many hundreds that go through there literally in several days' time. So after closeout, what's going to be key for us is, we want to continue this program as long as it is feasible and practical. And so we want to continue to use program income, and more so than ever, we want to leverage that program income, especially after closeout. Once you hit 100%, there's every reason in the world to try and leverage every dollar of program income. Part of what we're really stressing is the idea of maybe taking the program income, no more than 20% of an acquisition, try and leverage that with other grant funds, foundation funds. We're aggressively going after monies that we can use, so for example, for any acquisition, only 20% would be program income, the rest would be other funds, and that allows us to stretch those dollars further. Of course, that means that, going out there and really trying to find those other sources of funds, and so we're trying to make that happen. Also, it's nice to see that we have the ability to develop a lot of our own lots. We've purchased a lot of land, and in some cases, many of our members had lots, in their portfolio. So we are now aggressively looking to redevelop those lots. And of course, after construction, the resale, there'll be a significant program income that comes back. And we think it's the redevelopment that will sustain at least the next 12 to 18 months of the program. Also, there's we had significant multifamily, and one of the strategies that we have implemented and will continue to implement is the idea of buying distressed multifamily properties, which were hard to come by 12 months ago. I've noticed there's more in the market now, so we're going after multifamily, stabilizing those properties, and obviously you have to do the analysis to pick them up at a price point that allows you to be able to refinance those properties, service the debt, and then have program income that you can put back to work. So those are three of the strategies that we'll look at, especially after closeout. We are aggressively seeking to layer program income as well, and this is more on the housing or the home buying side. I think we touched on this a little bit, but there are funds out there. I mentioned the Wells Fargo Lift funds. Definitely funds that you can layer with your with your activity to get really, at the end of the day, it allows us to minimize the direct subsidy that we leave there, and again, it allows us to take that program income a little bit further out in the program. So, again, we're aggressively looking to leverage program income through other sources of funds, other grants, foundation dollars, even private capital, of course, and then also looking to layer it with other sources of funds like Wells Fargo and any other lender that would have programs in place. The other thing that is very important is for us to look and see how we can work with other NSP grantees. We are in 8 states in the District of Columbia, and there's a lot of other grantees in those areas, and I think it's very important that we look at what the NSP1 and NSP3 and certainly other NSP2 grantees have in terms of program income, and figure out how maybe we can work together to really leverage the program income dollars to create significant impact in our neighborhoods. So anyhow, I'll stop there. I think that's hopefully gives you a little bit of idea of what Chicanos por la Casa is doing with their program income.
Great, thank you so much. And you'll be available on the line, so if there are questions specific to what Herman was talking about, we can also address those. So just to go back over how you ask a question, you have 2 ways that you can do this. You can go on the upper right-hand part of your screen where there's the feedback square and change the green to purple, and you'll be able to insert a question, which we'll be able to see and then try to address. You also, using our conference call, can press 1 and be connected with the operator to be able to ask a question. So at this point, why don't we go to the questions that we have that have been inserted through the live meeting. So Suzanne has put in, raised her hand to ask a question, but we don't have an actual question typed in. So I think what we will ask to do is if Suzanne, if you can hit 1 and call in, we'll come back to you on that. So we'll
actually, sir, it's *1 if you'd like to signal for a question over the phone line.
Great, thank you. So let's go on to Robin has a question. Her question is, the Housing Authority has not received NSP2 funds from HUD, but this Housing Authority has then sold homes to a developer who has been using NSP2 funds for the acquisition. What is the Housing Authority's responsibility for compliance? Is this considered program income for the Housing Authority? I'm assuming that what you're asking about is, since you've sold properties to an NSP2 project, and so you've been reimbursed for that sale with NSP2 funds, whether you have a compliance responsibility. So we categorize program income as funds that come back to a grantee or a subrecipient. And in this case, it does not appear that the Housing Authority is in either one of those roles, but simply has had properties that they sold to a developer. So the money coming back to the Housing Authority is not considered program income, doesn't have any compliance restrictions for that, other than what you might have internally on your own from the source of funds that you might have used originally to purchase those properties. The developer who received the funding from the NSP2 grantee will have some restrictions, perhaps in their funding agreement, and of course, affordability requirements and eligible beneficiaries, those sorts of things. But the program income requirements would not track with the funds that came back to the Housing Authority as a result of that sale. Let's move on to the next question from Brenda. And she asked, the NSP1 rental properties purchased by the county were transferred via mortgage deed to 3 not-for-profit organizations and 1 for-profit real estate company. Is program income, the net after reserves and operating expenses, required to be returned to the county's NSP during the affordability period? The county did not receive any proceeds from the title transfer. So when we're defining what is program income and what is not, we're looking at is the property held by the county or the subrecipient, or is it held by a developer? And in this case, the county transferred those properties to a developer. So the money coming back, that stream of income from rent and if there were other revenues, is not considered program income. Now, if the county provided the funds to the developer in the form of a loan, and there are payments that are coming back from the either not-for-profit or for-profit real estate entities, if that money is being paid back to the subrecipient or to the grantee, that money, the loan payments, would then be considered program income and would need to be tracked and followed in that way. But the actual rent, net operating funds that are coming in on that property to the developer are not going to be considered program income.
That's just one little final twist on that, which is that whether they stay with the subrecipient or are returned to the county is really a matter to be negotiated and should be part of any agreement that the county used to transfer them. So the funds are program income, but they could stay with the subrecipient.
Absolutely. And then, as we mentioned, if they actually stay with the subrecipient, the grantee will have to have systems to be able to track and ensure that those are being reutilized appropriately and that the compliance is maintained on those.
Right.
Okay, so let's go on to, we have a question from Scott who is asking, saying, program income is derived from cash flow on multifamily projects, is based on a pro rata basis from the monies used for the development of the project. And so he's giving an example that we have $3 million from city funds, $3 million from NSP2 funds were used for $6 million development. So 50% of the net operating income for that property is considered program income before debt service. And his question is, after stabilization, if $1.5 million of the NSP2 funds are recaptured via a senior mortgage, so this is program income, is the cash flow allocated to the NSP2, and he's showing then the new configuration on funding on this project after the recapture of this fund as being $3 million. That's city funds, $1.5 million of NSP2, and $1.5 million in mortgage. Does this modify or reduce the new pro rata basis now that the NSP funds in the project have been reduced or recaptured to 1.5? So when the senior mortgage took out $1.5 million, I'm going to presume that those funds were paid back to the NSP program. It came back in the form of program income. So those funds have already been recaptured and already are following the program income restrictions. So yes, at this point you now have modified what is remaining as subsidy because you've already recaptured some of that. So now you have a reduced level of NSP funds, so your proration of the net operating income that's going to come in would have to then be modified to meet with that new configuration of funding on that. Okay, and we'll move on to Kate's question, asking, will the substantial amendment rules continue past closeout? And her example is the process to revise boundaries. John, do you want to field this one?
Yeah, we don't think that we will require amendments after closeout. It's not finalized yet, but I don't think we've just practically got a process, where enough people, 8 years from now to be reviewing these things. So that's our current estimate.
Great. Okay. So we'll move on. We've got a question from Sean asking, do we need to amend the action plan if we add a new activity to an existing project using program income? So anything that you are doing as part of your program would need to be something that was included in your action plan. So I guess my answer would be, and John, you can jump in here, would be that you would, if you're adding a new activity that you had not included originally, you'd have to go back and amend.
Yes, up to the point of closeout. Again, if we don't require amendments at that point, then you wouldn't have to. But for the next couple of years, you would have to make that amendment, and that would include, as I think your earlier slide showed, adding revolving fund, even though it's not necessarily a new activity; it's a new use of funds. Those are mostly local amendments. Only NSP2 is required to come in here. So you do those locally. You work with your HUD field office. You go through. Primarily the point of those is to inform your citizens and your neighbors just what you're doing.
Okay. And next we have a question from Ria. Can you give an example of an NSP2 revolving loan fund activity? So, for instance, on Herman's example of doing home ownership development, you could have a revolving loan fund that was set up specifically for home buyer development, and that might be, use B, acquisition, rehab, resale, and so as funds are coming back from program incomes received from a similar activity, would continue to come back into that revolving loan fund, and you would continue to fund new activities. As those new units were completed, were able to be then sold, the proceeds from that sale would again come back into that revolving loan fund. And of course, the amount may be declining over time as you leave some subsidy in for each one of those projects. Okay, that appears to be the questions that we have submitted so far through the live meeting. I wonder if we can look, if our operator can let us know if we have folks that want to ask questions.
At this time, I show no questions over the phone lines. Again, as a reminder, ladies and gentlemen, to signal for a question or comment, please press *1 on your telephone keypad at this time.
Okay. I think what we'll do in the meantime, so we may have some folks that want to ask some additional questions. That would be great. I'll just mention we have 2 more slides here which talk about some of the other resources. So there was a policy alert on program income that was put out dated 7/13 of 2011. I mentioned earlier this August 20th of 2012 policy alert on revolving loan funds. There also is the NSP combined program notice, which has some language pertaining to the use of program income. And then there have been a number of webinars and other materials that are provided. If you were to go to the NSP Help website, you actually, for any of the webinars in particular, you can pull up both the transcript, but also you can listen to the webinars and see the slides that were provided. And you'll also, for these policy alerts, those also are searchable on that same website. Also, this last reference is for the actual CDBG regulations, where they explain the restrictions concerning program income, and you will also find the references for revolving loan funds and the requirements that relate to those. I'll also mention and encourage folks, we have a link on the last slide here of asking folks to complete a very short survey which provides some feedback on the types, how you feel about this presentation, and also what would be useful for folks going forward on this. And we really encourage folks to take a little bit of time and actually give us some information on that.
And, sir, I do show a question over the phone lines. It comes from Shelley.
Great.
And, ma'am, your line is now open.
Hi, this is Shelley. My question comes, you guys had mentioned there was a 5-year period for subrecipients for program income that must come back. Can you expand on that a little bit?
So the requirement is that 5 years after the closeout of that subrecipient's grant. So it's not necessarily 5 years after you've completed the activities that you were funded to undertake on behalf of the grantee, but it's from that actual closeout. So at the point that you have completed all of your activities and you've met the national objectives and been able to complete that, the grantee should be closing out that grant award, and that would essentially then start the clock ticking for that 5-year period. So after 5 years after that period, funds that are received back no longer, they're coming to the subrecipient, no longer will have that tag of program income and need to be tracked and reported. But you would need to be able to show when that actual closeout was and be able to track the date to be able to show, when things actually switch over from being program income and when they lose that identity.
And again, that was on the grantee's closeout, not the subrecipient's closeout?
It's on the subrecipient's closeout.
Okay, perfect. And then I have another question. When you guys had talked about switching over from DRGR to IDIS, when we do that, if there's still funds that are sitting in the Treasury that we can draw from because we've had so much program income, we can't get those funds. So we've heard that those funds are going to be still available to us, but how are we going to draw those? Or is that something we don't know yet? Are we going to draw it from the DRGR system or IDIS?
John, do you want to handle this one?
Okay, so you won't be able to make the switch to IDIS until closeout. Right. So you're and you can't close out until your line of credit is closed.
Well, and what we've I think heard earlier was that the way we will determine when you're eligible for closeout is when that cumulative between spending from your actual allocation and your expenditure of program income comes to cumulatively to the level of what your allocation was.
No. That is when you have met, that is when you have satisfied the 100% expenditure amount, right? So next spring, when we look at NSP1 and NSP2 to see which of our grantees have satisfied the 100% expenditure mark, we'll be looking at a combination of the funds that have been drawn down from your line of credit as well as the funds that have been drawn down from program income. Now, fast forward to closeout. When you want to close out your grant, in essence what you're saying is that you're going to be signing off, forfeiting any funds that may be remaining in your line of credit, right? So, if there's $1, $5 that are in there, something that you don't have a way of using, right, because it's just too small, then that's fine. You just forfeit that. But the expectation is that you will have used up your funds to qualify you to close out your grant.
Oh, okay.
Right. So that's why I say please don't confuse the two terms that we're talking about here. Next spring, right? The rush to next spring is to spend 100%, an amount equal to 100% of your allocation. But your grant can very well remain open for next couple of years, maybe, because it takes you that long to draw down the balance of funds in your line of credit.
I think the reason we may have some of that confusion is I believe at one point folks had been told that essentially when you reached that expenditure that was equal to your appropriation, that sort of a snapshot would be taken in time of that, and once you had met your national objectives on those activities, that you would be eligible for closeout. So I think that was some interim guidance, and so it sounds like we have more clarity on that at this point.
Right. Well, a couple things I will say is that, we realize, there's a lot of balls in the air. A number of things are going to be changing as we're closing out these grants. So following publication of the closeout notice, there will be a guide that will be published that walks you through the notice, that shows you all of the different components that will have to be met, all the different criteria that will have to be met in order to close out your grant. So there should be no confusion there. There'll be a checkoff list, and then there will be technical assistance providers who will review packages for grantees before they're submitted to HUD. So there'll be plenty of opportunities to ask questions, to make sure you're on the right track, to get all of these issues resolved before we come to an end.
All right. Well, thank you. That was I appreciate that because that was not our understanding. So you set us straight. Thank you.
Wes, I want to go back to the first part of that question. I mean, I think that we've said that the 5-year period applies to proceeds from the sale of real property, but I don't think that it applies to all program income that the subrecipient would receive.
I was particularly asking about rents. So if there is a difference, then maybe I misunderstood.
I think that's a good point, that the change of use issue pertains to proceeds coming back from real property, but it would not apply to other revenue that's coming back to the subrecipient.
Yeah.
So, for example, rents, for a subrecipient on rents, that would always have to be tracked in program income forever.
Pretty much, yeah.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you very much.
And if you had like a loan portfolio where you had payments coming in over time, same sort of thing.
Okay, but the 5-year is only if they sold a piece of property and it was after that 5-year closeout period, then they could actually keep it and it wouldn't be reported as program income.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And at this time, I show no additional questions over the phone lines.
Okay. And I believe we've answered all of the questions that were submitted on the live meeting. So I'm thinking this would be the end of our session. And want to thank all of the team of panel members that helped on answering questions and dealing with the scenarios. And again, encourage folks to take the time to look at the survey and provide some feedback to folks. And I think this concludes our webinar. Thank you.
And that does conclude today's conference. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your participation. You may now disconnect.
Recipient nonprofits of a grantee. Maybe that.